All right, guys, we got one more thing I want to work out before reinstalling the engine, and that is connecting the rear set to the factory brake linkage for the rear brake. I've seen this done a dozen different ways, but I think the simplest way on the 450 is going to be to actually leave the factory pull rod and this arm back here in position and replicate. So I've got the factory rear brake pedal still installed. There's a shaft that runs through from this side of the frame to the other, and this is also where in the middle here your center stand would pivot, and it clears the frame. I think what I'm going to do is actually replace this shaft with a piece of pipe that I can have that will extend past the frame. We'll replicate this piece here that the brake rod connects to. That way we're not changing any of the movement. Get out of here, cat. And I don't have to make any new brackets. The shaft will just pass through these existing brackets here. And then we'll use some kind of arm to connect from the rear set to an additional piece we'll weld on there. So when you push down on the rear set, that's going to pull a piece down here, and that's going to essentially act the same way the brake lever is. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure the offset from the existing whatever you want to call it here, bar, where the brake rod connects to here. So that's the distance here, because that's at minimum I need to extend the shaft that far. And then I'll pull these pieces off, we'll get them on the bench, and we'll take some additional measurements. Okay, so here's the parts of the factory setup. So we've got this shaft that everything pivots on, we got a thrust washer here, and our brake lever. So all we're really concerned with is this end. This is the stopper, so you can adjust where the brake lever rests. We will be replicating this, but not in this position. I think I've got an idea of where that can go, so it's out of the way, and we don't have to, I really don't want to have to use any of this. I've seen some of them done where they basically took this, cut it down to about here, so they could keep this, and this is where your brake, the light switch spring is going to mount to. We're going to move this over to I guess the main body of this thing. There is clearance there between the frame and the engine. So before I pulled it off, I did measure the offset between this and our rear set. That worked out to be about 2 inches. And we're going to replicate the distance from the shaft here to the inside, and I'm also going to just keep the length of this, and Honda made it that length for a reason, so I'm just going to leave well enough alone. And in addition to that, here's the other side of the rear set, but the measurement's the same. The other piece we're going to make, it's going to look similar to this, but it needs to be this length. That way you've got kind of a one-to-one transfer of movement. So I need to measure from the center of here to the center of this hole, and that's going to give me the length of the other piece. So let me grab the materials I have. I'll show you what I'm working with, and then we'll get cutting here. Okay, so this shaft measures out to just shy of 3/4 of an inch, which is geez, these cats this morning. So that made things easy. I've got some 3/4 inch outside diameter tube here. It has an 1/8 inch wall, so it's nice and sturdy. I've got no concerns about flex with something this thick. You could probably get away with something thinner, but I have this, and I would rather overbuild this a little bit, especially dealing with brakes, than to risk going with thinner wall pipe and have something flex. I've also got some 1 inch outer diameter pipe here, and more importantly, it is 0.76 inches inside diameter. So 1/100th of an inch larger than this. So that's going to work perfectly for this component, and for the bars that everything's going to connect to, I've got some 3/16 by 3/4 inch flat bar here. Let me get things set up. I gotta get the tools out, and then we'll get cutting, and I'll come back in a minute. Alright, so we've got our main components cut here. We've got the outer sleeve, shaft, and I didn't cut the two bars, or whatever you want to call them, apart, because what I'm actually going to do is I left an inch in between the two pieces. I'm going to cut these with a 1-inch hole saw, and that's going to give me the profile I want to be able to fit on this piece and get a good tight weld. So the other thing I want to do before we test fit this on the bike is the stock shaft uses a cotter pin at one end as a backup to hold it in place. So I want to do something similar on this one. So I need to drill a hole through this pipe, and then we'll be able to kind of mock things up for the first time. Alright, so we got our main components cut here. You can see now what I was talking about by cutting it with the hole saw. We've got a nice profile there. It's going to fit around our sleeve and should weld up pretty clean. I also went ahead and put a cotter pin in the end of the pipe here. I've intentionally left this about an inch or two long because I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to secure the other end. So you can see here on the stock one, it's flared out. So this would go in from the right side of the bike, and that's what's holding the brake lever in place. I don't have any means of doing this, so odds are I'll use a cotter pin on this side as well. But I'll need some kind of thrust washer just so that this isn't pivoting up against the cotter pin. I'm going to rough fit these two pieces on the bike and double check my measurements, and then we can weld initially this piece. So if you remember, this longer one is replicating the original, so this would fit around it like so, and these holes line up. I kept this distance here, that way I'm not messing with any of Honda's geometry on that end of things. So let's go over to the bike, get this fit up, and see where we're at. Okay, so I've got the pipe installed. I've gone ahead, like I said, I don't have a thrust washer I'm going to use, so I'm using two copper washers here to space it out. The two of them together are the same thickness as the factory thrust washer. So, and like I said, I left this intentionally long here, but everything does seem to fit. This pivots well. This is the arm that will connect this shaft to the rear set, and I'm going to add, this is the same measurement. Again, I want a one-to-one kind of translation of movement here. So this one is going to be welded roughly here. That needs to line up So you want this parallel with this. So I've gone ahead and figured out basically where I want this. So I'm going to pull this back off. I'm going to weld the taller one first. That one's going to sit inside here, and that connects to the brake arm, which I've removed. And once that's in place, I can double check the offset, and then I can tack this one in place, and then we'll come back and see where we're at there. All right, so I've got this one positioned where I need it. I measured this distance to be 1.25 inches, and I got that from the factory brake lever. So I've got everything squared up here, cleaned up. I'm gonna go tack this in place, and then we'll be right back. Okay, so I've got this tacked in place and test fit on the bike here, and you can see the alignment. I've got it, if this will focus here, attached to the brake rod. So I'm happy with the positioning of this, and now I need to figure out the angle that I want the other piece to be attached at. So that's, like, if you remember, that's going to go right about here, but I need the angle of that to match roughly the angle of this. Now this is adjustable on these rear sets, so I can clock this to perfectly match wherever we wind up with the piece over here, but I want it roughly in the ballpark so that we've got plenty of clearance for the linkage that we're going to use. Okay, so I got the other piece tacked on, and I've got it installed on the bike. The brake rod is installed, and you can see around here where it connects there. And if I back up here, you can see we've got the angle of this piece here and the new piece roughly at the same angle. Like I said, we can tweak this. There is quite a bit of adjustability here. But for the time being, I'm going to attach those 2 points with these Heim joints and a piece of 6mm all thread, and we'll double check that everything is going to line up, and then the next step is going to be figuring out where I need to trim the shaft to, because right now it's just a little bit too long. It's keeping this brake pedal from working. Alright, so we've got everything kind of finger tight here. You can see the alignment there. Everything's in line, so we shouldn't have any of the pieces trying to rack back and forth as we're applying the brakes. And if this pipe wasn't in the way, and actually I could probably slide that back. So let me push that back. So now you can kind of see how everything works here. So we push down on the brake lever. That's going to pull this back, which in turn pulls this back, rotates the whole assembly, and that's what actuates the arm on the inside. So pushing down, you can see the brake lever there. The one thing we need to add next is a stopper right here, and that's going to allow us to adjust things. So I'm going to pull everything back apart. We'll get back over on the bench and figure out how we're going to make that next piece. All right, so here's the factory setup, and basically it's a piece of flat bar. Theirs has some wings here. It's got a nut welded to it. This is your adjusting bolt, and it's got a jam nut to lock everything in place. So I think I'm just going to use a piece of the same 3/16 by 3/4 inch flat bar and basically weld a nut to it, figure out the position, weld it on ours, and I could probably use this same bolt and jam nut here if I wanted to. I've got this stopper tacked in place. Like I said before, I wound up using the 3/16 by 3/4 inch flat bar, and instead of welding a nut to it, I figured it was thick enough. I just drilled and tapped it for an M6 bolt. I've temporarily just put one of these Allen screws and a jam nut on here, and I'm going to get this fit back on the bike, and we'll see if I got this angle right. Okay, so everything's back on the bike. You can see now how this comes into play. So this is going to allow us to adjust things both up here, and then you've got the original adjustment back there. And when you push this down, this is what's stopping that. So, and again, that's basically just a piece of flat bar, and you can see as I'm winding this out, it's adjusting the pitch of the whole assembly here. And now we've got a little bit more throw in our lever. So yeah, pretty simple. There's two other components to this that the factory setup has that we're going to need. One of them is, so here's where the factory brake switch would mount, and that's just that little plunger type switch with a long spring on it. And there is enough clearance to connect it from here back to the front side of our sleeve here. So I think that's what I'm going to do, rather than making some kind of extension to try to run it through here, which is where the factory setup would have been. The other is a heavy duty return spring, and even though this is springing back into place from the springs inside the brake drum, what it's not doing is preventing everything from shifting up and down when the suspension compresses. So basically, when you compress the suspension, it's shoving this rod forward, and in turn that's going to move your whole lever assembly. Now that spring helps prevent that, and basically forces all of that up and down movement into this spring here, which is what we want. So I need to work that out. The factory spring mounts right here, and it would connect basically straight down to the brake lever, which basically comes all the way under here. So we don't have that, so I need to figure out if I need to weld some kind of mount to the inside of the frame so we can attach it to that sleeve, but I haven't quite figured that out yet, so that's going to be next on the list. But so far so good. Happy with the position of everything. The actuation of the brake feels really good. Nothing's racking side to side, so I think we've got the alignment squared away. So again, we've got these this joint here, and we've got the alignment of the shaft back here, basically mimicking the original setup. So I don't have anything holding this in place, but as I'm moving it, it's not moving side to side at all. So I think we've got everything aligned pretty good. All right, I think I've taken this thing as far as I can for now. I've worked out everything except the return spring. Let me grab it here. So here is the factory return spring, and where it mounts on the brake lever, it's just way too far forward for the setup we're using. We'd essentially have some kind of extension coming about 8 inches from here, kind of hanging down under the bike. And I just don't want to do that unless I absolutely have to. So I think what I'm going to try to look for is some kind of torsion spring. I've got one ordered. I don't know if it's going to be the right size, but it's basically going to fit around this end as you apply the brakes, and this pulls forward. The tension of that torsion spring should push it back when you release the brake. And again, the reason for that is to keep this from moving as the swing arm bounces up and down. So hopefully that'll be here in the next week or so. I wanted to give you this view because when it's on the bike, it's kind of hard to see the different components. So the factory brake arm connects here. This is where the linkage from the rear set will attach to. This is our stopper and adjustment here. And then this little one here is where the brake switch connects to. This is our 3/4 inch outside diameter piece of tube that we're using as the pivot. And again, that replaced this factory pivot. If I had access to a lathe, I guess it'd be nice to add some channels in here like we have here for grease, but I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. I suppose time will tell. If we have to, we'll make adjustments down the road. And for the time being, I don't have proper thrust washers, so I'm using these copper washers. For the sole reason it's all I have available to me right now with the proper inside diameter. So let me jump back over the bike and I'll show you how all this stuff hooks up. Okay, so here it is on the bike, and like I said, it's kind of tough to see when it's actually on here, but you can see we're using the factory mount for the brake switch, and normally that would come down in front of this piece of the frame here, but there is enough room. I was able to tuck it back behind. Let me see if I can get a shot here. And it's hooking to that little tab I showed you under here. There's our adjustable stop down here and the linkage to actuate everything. So when we push down on the rear set, it's kind of just rotating the whole assembly, and in turn you can see back here we're actuating the brake, and that is adjusted to the way it should be in a factory setup. So hopefully it'll function pretty similar to the way it would have with the original one. So everything's just held in place with a cotter pin at this end, and there's another cotter pin at the other end. So all in all, I'm pretty pleased. Lots of trial and error trying to get things fit, but in the end, the only thing I'm a little concerned with is the position of the tab that this switch spring connects to. It doesn't have a whole lot of rotation before the brake pads engage. I can adjust that by loosening up the brakes, then we're affecting the functionality. So that'll be something once everything's hooked up. I did check it with a multimeter, and the way I have it adjusted right now, we've got about a 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch of travel before the brakes are fully engaged, and that is enough to trip this switch. So it may or may not be an issue. It's something that I can adjust by moving the little tab that it mounts to, but that's kind of the one unknown in terms of the setup I currently have. And then the other big unknown is that return spring. That's something that we can't do without. I'm hoping the one I ordered works, but like I said, either way I'll follow up in the next video. That should have arrived by then. Hopefully this helped. This was certainly one of the sticking points the last time we attempted this build. We never quite got this worked out. I'm pretty confident in this setup, so hopefully this will give you some ideas for your own build. If you have any questions, by all means let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.